We're building a real-time calculator on a web page. So we'll apply all the things which we have learned till now, including HTML, CSS, Bootstrap, and JavaScript. So let's get started. So this is the fun part. I believe that how much ever you learn the theory, it's best to get a hands-on practice of the things you learn, because then personally I don't forget stuff if I have practiced it a bit. So I've removed everything that was in the body. Let's change the title to creating our own calculator. Let's refresh this. Yeah. So I'll just give you an example of how our calculator is going to look. So let's say I type in here 10 plus 15 and I press equal to, then I'm getting the value over here. I can also press on these buttons and it shows me the history of the calculation as well as the results in this box over here. So we are going to build this using Bootstrap and JavaScript. So let's get started. First of all, what we'll do is we'll create the basic outline of the HTML without adding any functionality or JavaScript to it. So first of all, I'll create a container and I'll add a row to it. So this is the standard procedure. I always start with creating a container, then a row. In this case, what we want is that the calculator should not take the entire width of the container. It should take 50% and it should be centered. So to do that, so there are 12 imaginary columns. To take 50% means we'll be using 6 columns, and there are 3 columns which are invisible over here. So let's add those columns. Div class call. We'll be using a large column because if the calculator width gets too small on smaller screens, that won't look good. So you can see this calculator is better than having a very narrow calculator. So that's why we'll be using call LG instead of call MD, and we'll keep the 3 imaginary columns over here and we won't add any code to it. So this will create the offset that we required. Next, I'll create another call LG with 6 columns, and here we'll add all our code. Let's add a text center class as well so that all the text inside the calculator is center aligned. To make this card look good, I've also added a shadow to it. So we'll use the Bootstrap class shadow. Let's save this. So I'll refresh this. So as we have not added any content, so we don't see anything. So let's first create another row inside of this, which has the call as well. And there we write calculator. Yeah, so we have the calculator here, but let's add some margin on top of the container. So great, it looks good, but having a bit of a padding on the top would make it look even better. So to our row, let's add some uh, padding as well. Let's add it in the both the directions. Yeah, what we can do now is we can apply some styles to make the calculator look like this. So I have used the classes button and button primary to make the calculator look blue. So you can see now that the calculator is blue, but it's not taking the entire width. To make the calculator take the entire width of the column, let's create our own class named full width. So I'll create a style tag. I'll add the class full width, which will put the property of width to be 100%. Let's add it to this row. So now you can see that the calculator is taking the entire width of the row. Also, let's add some padding or margin on top of the calculator as well. Yeah, so now it looks better. Ours is a bit thicker, but that's fine. Next, let's create the text area where we'll be adding the history of our calculations. So let's create another row. Inside that we have a column. We'll also add a margin of 3 in the y direction. And I guess you might have forgotten by now, but we also have an element in HTML named text area. So let's use that to add. Yeah, so you can see we have the text area. So let's add the full width class to this text area as well, so that it takes the entire width. Also, let's add a padding of 3 in all the directions of the text area. So this is how the text area looks. We can even type anything we want, but that's not possible over here. So we need to disable this text area. To do that, you just need to write read only attribute over here. And you can see the text area has now become ineditable. Next, let's add an ID to this because we'll be requiring it later on. And let's name it history. Also, there is an attribute named rows. So let's have our 4 rows in this text area. So you can see that the number of rows has increased. So we'll be able to see 4 rows in this text area. Also, let's add some content to this text area. So it's not visible. Just a moment. So whenever we add some content to the text area, by default, it will be center aligned because our parent class is center aligned. We want to make it right aligned as in this case. So let's add the class text right over here. So we can't actually see some text over here right now, but later on when we update the contents using JavaScript, just a moment. Yeah, so later on when we'll be updating the contents using JavaScript, you'll be able to see the text in the right hand direction. So now that we have our text area as well, let's have a look at what other things which we require over here. So we need an input. So we are inputting some text over here. So we need to have an input element. So to do that, first of all, we'll need to create another row and break it down into 2 main columns, which will be further broken down into 3 columns. So let's start doing that. So div class row. So it will be broken down into 2 main columns. The first column would take 10 of the 12 imaginary columns. This will contain the input element of type text having the class full width so that it takes the entire width. Let's put the ID of this input as result, and that's it. An input tag does not have a slash input to close it. You don't need to close an input tag. So that's it. We have added the input. Let's have a look how this input looks like. So yeah, this input is now visible. Next, so what we need to do is we need to actually have multiple buttons below this input as well. So we'll need to create another row and a column and add the input inside of it. Yeah, it does not make any change right now, but we'll be adding multiple rows inside this column 10. So let's start adding those rows. Yeah, so it will have a column also. So just a second, this column would be of size 4. So if you just break this part down into 12 columns, imaginary, each of the buttons takes 4 of the imaginary 12 columns. So this would be called 4. Next, let's create another row which has a column which has an input of type button having value equal to 1 and class full width. I hope everyone is able to understand exactly what is happening. So let's refresh it to see what happened. So using this code, we were able to add a button below the input to just add a bit of a, so there is no margin over here as well. So let's leave it out. So now we have one button. To replicate more buttons, you can just copy and paste this row below each other. And let's see. So yeah, now we have 4 buttons over here. What we want to do is we want to change its value to 1, 4, 7, and a dot. So that's it. Let's also add some padding below this. So to do that, we can just add a padding PB3 to the top column as well. So that did not work actually. I believe we need to add this padding to this column. And yeah, that works. So next, coming back to our code of creating the inputs, we were able to create one column. What I'll do is I'll just add all the other columns as well because that's a repetitive code. So I'll just copy this code and add these columns as well and the next columns. So you can see we have added all the further columns which were required inside this call 12. We have to yet complete the call 2 buttons. Also, you can see I have already assigned an on-click listener to these inputs. These Whenever this button is pressed, a function named dis is called with the value 6. So let's add these on-click event listeners to the ones which we created in the beginning as well. So when this button is pressed, we'll add, so we'll pass the value 1 to this, we'll add pass 4, we'll pass 7 and a dot. Yeah, so there is one special button in all of them, which is the equal to sign. So what should happen when we press equal to, then this expression should be evaluated. So we have a different function for this equal to sign, which is solve. So we have yet not defined the functions, but whenever this button is pressed, we'll be calling the solve function. So we have created our calculator's left hand side part. Let's create the remaining part as well. So I'll just copy the code. So let's find where the call 10 was present and just add this code after that. By the way, all of this code will be available to you, so you can have a look at these codes to further understand how exactly the HTML part of this calculator has been written. So in this call to, you can see there's a C button which should clear the expressions which was written in the input button. So it has a different function. Next, on slash, the general function dis is called. Similarly for all the minus, plus and multiplication input buttons as well. So great, we have created the structure of the calculator, but when we click these buttons, nothing works. And you can see an error in the console saying this is not defined. So clear is not defined and so on. So let's start writing the logic part of this calculator. So for that, we'll need to add JavaScript code to script. So let's create a script tag. Inside this, first let's create the clear function. So in this function clear, what we want to do is we want to access this input element and put its inner HTML to blank. So we'll access our element by its ID, which was result, if you remember. So we have our input over here. Just a moment. Yeah. So we have the input over here, which has the ID result. So we'll get the element by its ID and set its value to blank. So if you want to change the value of an input, you need to access its value property. So let's see if this works. Let's write something. And when I press C, this input is now cleared. So great, the clear function seems to be working. Next, let's work on the dis function, which was called whenever we press these buttons. So you can see this is not defined. So let's first define this function. Next, so you can see a value is passed whenever the dis function is called. So we'll get that value using the argument. Next, what we want to do is inside result, we want to append whatever button we press. So to append, we can directly do plus equal to the value. This is just a short notation of writing value is equal to the current value plus the value which we got from the arguments. So the shorthand notation of writing this is just plus equal to. Let's see if these buttons work right now. So when I press 258, you can see these values are being passed over here and being appended to the value of result. So great, our calculator now seems to be working, but there is one catch. The equal to sign yet does not work because we have not written the solve function. So let's write the solve function as well. So great, we have defined the solve function. So let's first analyze what our solve function should do. It should evaluate this expression, whichever is present in this input, and then create a history of it in the text area. So to do that, first of all, we'll need to access the history. So let's create a var text area element and get it by document.get element by id history. So if we go back to our text area, yeah, you can see I have already provided it with an ID of history. So we have the text area element. Next, we need to get the expression in this input. So we can do that by document.get element by ID result.value. So var, let's name it just x is equal to this value. Inside JavaScript, there is a really nice pre-built function written named eval. So we'll just use eval to evaluate the string which was present inside this input. You don't need to worry. Even I did not know about this function before taking the session. What I did was I searched on JavaScript on Google that is there a function which can evaluate a string expression, and it gave me the results. So whenever you feel that you want to do something, just first search it on Google if it is already present, and it will save you a lot of time. So now we have our results inside the y variable. What we need to do is we need to first clear the text present in the input. So to do that, we can just reuse our clear function. So we can clear the function by this command. Next, what we need to do is we need to write the results and the expression in the history. So text area element dot value is equal to text area element dot value plus x, which was the expression, plus equal to plus y, which was the result, and an enter. So those familiar with coding would know that slash n is for new line. Those who are not familiar, this is nothing but a cool way of writing enter. So that should add our text inside the history as well. Let's save this and see whether this works or not. So let's clear this. I'll write 2 plus 3 equal to, so yeah, you can see that we are getting our expression over here. So that's really great. We have built our own calculator. So yeah, it's working perfectly fine. So the basic idea was we spent a lot of time in building the exact structure of the HTML. We added some on-click event listeners, and then we binded them to the functions. In the functions, we wrote the logic that when clear is called, the result value should be made blank. Whenever this is called, the value should be appended to the input. Next, whenever solve is called, the text area should be cleared, its values should be evaluated, and they should be displayed in the text area element. So we can also reduce this code by doing a plus equal to, just like we did in the function dis. So if we do 3 plus 9 equal to, um, okay, it gave an error. So let's just revert back to the previous method. Let's clear it. So clear has stopped working. There seems to be some error. Yeah, so that's now solved. Yeah, so there was some caching error because of which I was not able to get it work properly. I just did Control Shift R or a hard reload, and it's working perfectly fine now. So that's it. Um, I guess this is it about building a calculator. Also, if you notice, the calculator looks really nice even when you keep on decreasing the width of the window. It does not collapse. That's because of Bootstrap. It's being automatically responsive. And using JavaScript, you have already seen how we have added the logic. You can maybe style this a little better by adding some padding on top of these buttons, but you can do that. So that's left for you.